Hello and welcome to War Thunder with your host Czar Peppers. Today is the first episode of my new Know Your Enemy series, where we'll take a look at the individual tanks of a particular tier and country, try and find weak spots, identify the strong spots, and identify important modules inside that you can take out. Now the first tank we're going to be looking at today is the legendary T-34, which is considered by many to be the best tank of the Second World War. Now, what made it so impressive? Well, let me give you a little demonstration. In the early days of Operation Barbarossa, stuff like this, the Panzer IV mounted with the 76mm short barrel gun, when it came across early Soviet tanks, it much went like this. What? You missed? Fire! Jawohl. We have eliminated the enemy. But then, they started encountering a new tank, which resulted in something like this. What is this new Russian nonsense? What? Did you miss? Fire again. What is this Russian witchcraft? 99999. But yes, it went much like this. The Panzer IVs with the short-barreled 76 and even the Panzer IIIs with the 50mm anti-tank guns could not penetrate the armor on this thing. Now, we know that you need to aim at that little spot on the turret, as I will demonstrate shortly. Shots on the side also deflected. And there we go. But, I mean, imagine trying to get that shot in a real tank with, I doubt you would have this kind of magnification. And see, even that was a miss. And this is in realistic mode. Alright, now let's take a look at why this armor is so effective. Because, unlike the KV-1, it doesn't have just super thick armor. It's only a thickness of 45mm in the front. However, the key is its slope, so its effective thickness is 81.4mm, or more depending on your angle. If you're angling your tank like this, then you'll get 96 on the front, 115 on the side, which for the tanks that Germany used in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa just couldn't penetrate it. But like everything, there are weak spots, and those are what we're going to take a look at right now. The most obvious one, but it's a bit tricky unless you're closer. Actually, it's not that hard a shot from far away, is right here on the gun, right on the turret, on the side, right beside the gun mantle. Only 46mm effective armor, and a shot there will take out the loader, the gunner, hopefully incapacitate the whole crew. Now, if you catch one of these things on the side, it's not particularly dangerous. Only 38.4mm effective thickness on the side. Down here, the same. The turret is a little bit better, 50mm, but not. Where this tank is really strong is when it's facing you like this. If you catch a T-34 at the side or the back, you don't have too much to worry about. But where do you want to hit to get the most effective bang for your buck? If you have the penetration ability to do 100mm, I find the best thing to do is aim for this part right here. It is thick, but if you can get through it, then you take out the driver, the machine gunner, and usually hit that ammo, which will destroy the tank. If you're trying to get it from the side, we have that ammunition right here. Now, what I like to do to try and remember where things are in the tank is take a look at where that ammunition is, and let's associate it with other parts of the tank. For example, you have the second road wheel here. The ammunition is just behind the second road wheel. Now, I like to think of multiple references because I find when you're looking at the tank and you see those reference points, you sort of automatically go for where you want to hit. So we got it right behind the rear wheel. It is to the left and below this little viewing port right here. And it is directly below of these three little latches here. So right down here. And I find as long as you memorize those reference points, you'll know where to hit through intuition. Well, not intuition, but you'll have trained yourself to automatically go for those spots. Now, if you're feeling really lucky, you can go for the machine gun port, which only has an effective thickness of 45 millimeters. However, you know, people who get that shot, I congratulate them sincerely, because it's a tough one to make unless you're super close. Now, also keep in mind that the T-34 has a diesel engine, so hitting its fuel tanks will not be as effective as, say, hitting the fuel tank of a Sherman, which uses aircraft fuel and is much more volatile. Now, I'm not 100% sure if they actually have a difference between diesel and aircraft fuel in this game, but if there is, that's one thing to know. Alright, so we've looked at the 1940 model. Let's move on to the next down the line, the T-34 from 1942. Now, there is a drastic improvement in this tank in the turret. It is far more difficult to penetrate here than it was on the previous model of T-34. They have also slightly improved the thickness of the hatch, the driver's hatch, I assume. The machine gun port is still a weak spot, and rather conveniently, the layout inside is more or less the same. You have the ammunition stored just behind that second wheel, and you can look from ammunition there directly below the hatch. Up front, we have the same weakness. If you can penetrate this, actually down to here, it's a bit easier to penetrate, 87 millimeters effective thickness. And if you can hit there, then again, machine gunner, driver, ammunition, tank gone. And now we come to the last T-34 of today, the T-34 ESTZ. On the front, very well sloped turret here, extremely small target for people try to penetrate. Right here where you have the 45 millimeters armor, just that little tiny triangle right there, because there you have 50 millimeters and then the turret behind it another 45. The machine gun port has been improved slightly, but you could still penetrate that quite easily with the ammunition that you would have in this tier. And also on the STZ there is an additional 15 millimeter plate on the front of the tank, giving it another 30 millimeters effective thickness, so even more difficult to penetrate at the front. Now, there's an interesting story that comes out of the period where the Germans and the Soviets were working together when they invaded Poland, where a number of people representing Soviet armor, the Soviet armor industry, went to go visit the plants where the Germans were producing their tanks. And when they saw the tanks they were building, they asked them, "Don't you have anything bigger?" And they replied, "No, we don't." And the Soviets didn't even believe them. They thought, how could the Germans not have a bigger tank than this? And of course the Germans had no idea that the Russians had anything like the T-34 or the KV-1 or the KV-2. In fact, the estimates by the Germans were that the Soviets had around 10,000 tanks, when the reality was they actually had 22,000 tanks. The T-34s generally all down the line are mounted with a 76mm cannon. The cannon on the ZIS is, I believe, has slightly better shell velocity than the earlier, I believe it's the L-34 cannons. It is a very effective anti-tank gun, and you definitely don't want to get in the way of it unless you are very well armored. It's very effective at taking out early Panzer 3s, 4s, and 2s. There are certain angles, if you encounter this thing at particular angles, there's just no point in risking getting in the way of that 76. Your best bet is to go around and try to approach him at a more favorable angle to yourself. Always approach a T-34 with great caution. They can be an extremely effective tank against most German and American tanks of the same tier. Now, what I like to do when I encounter one of these things, and his attention is upon me, is I approach with a very good angle on my tank to try and coax him into shooting that 76 while I am in a good position to take it. And then once he's fired it, I take the time while he reloads to turn my gun over and fire a shot, and then back down up into cover before he's had the chance to fire again. The Germans were so impressed with the T-34 that the Waffen-SS actually operated an entire battalion of captured T-34s led by the German tank ace, Emil Sebold. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. He destroyed 40 tanks in his T-34. Throughout the opening phase of the war in the Eastern Front, the Soviets didn't have T-34s in numbers to significantly halt the German advance. However, that changed in the defense for Moscow when reinforcements from Siberia with sizable numbers of T-34s came in to support and counterattack and successfully started pushing the German army back. And from that point, it was just a race for the Germans to try and come up with a tank that could successfully go up against a T-34, which is where the Tiger came from. But that is for another episode. Alright, now we move on to the KV-1L11. This is the first KV-1 that you'll get in the game. It is an extremely well-armored tank. And if you use angles, it's you can take a lot of battering in this thing. Let's take a look at why. At the front, you have this effective 85mm of armor. This slope section, 110. Here, 87. And 150 down a bit lower. Turret, more of the same. Just tons of steel upon steel upon steel. Even the side's pretty well armored, but there are tanks that can penetrate the side. And that's probably going to be your easiest bet if you encounter one of these things and don't have ammo with ridiculous penetration. Now, where do you want to hit when you get a shot at this thing? I find the best one is right here. Ammunition right at the back of the turret. Super easy to remember. So I always try and go for that shot when I have a chance. And if you can penetrate 87mm of armor, again down here, ammo stored on the floor, take out machine gunner and driver. Now on the KV-1 ZIS-5, they decided, you know what, let's just put some more steel on this thing. So now we have 100mm on the front, a 25mm steel plate on top of the 75mm of armor that was there before. Also have a plate down here. From the sides, pretty much the same. Ammo in the same position, fuel tank in the same position, ammunition stored on the floor. The KV-1 packs much the same gun as the T-34. I believe the first KV-1 has the L-34 and the second one has the same 76mm as the later T-34 ZIS. The KV-1 was pretty much just as much a shock to the Germans as the T-34 was, but considering that they were rather cumbersome vehicles to operate, they weren't nearly as influential as the T-34. In fact, many KV-1 crews only had about an hour's time to practice in the thing before they were expected to be proficient enough in it to go into combat. And because the commander was required to multitask,
meant that many of the tasks required to operate the tank were done less efficiently than they otherwise would be if it had a larger turret and another crew member, which was why they have a larger turret. Part of the reason why they have a larger turret on the KV-2. Now, if you encounter one of these things and you don't have the penetration to get through the front, there's really no point at shooting at the front. Your best bet is to try and get around to the side at as best an angle as possible, because that 75 millimeters of armor on the side can deflect a lot of shots if it's at the right angle, so you have to be pretty much firing straight at its side in order to penetrate it. Alright, last but certainly not least, well, actually on second thought it may actually be the least, because we have the T-28. Now if you're looking for weak spots on this thing, well, you have a plethora of flat surfaces to choose from. 22 millimeters, you can pretty much shoot this thing anywhere with anything and you would penetrate it. So the main thing we're worried about is where to shoot. Now as you see, we have ammunition surrounding the commander and loader on both sides. External references, this boxy bulge right here, you just want to hit on this side. So remember the box above this little wheel here, the second small wheel along the track, and directly below this little rivet line right here. From the front, I'd say your best thing to do is to go for these turrets. If you hit the turret, then you'll take out the machine gunners, and you'll hopefully hit this ammunition back here, and it'll explode. To be honest, it isn't really that difficult to penetrate this thing. Now the T-28E had some slight armor improvements, an extra 30 millimeters in this particular spot, where same place where you can hit the ammunition, but still it's not a whole lot. 30 millimeters still is not very hard to penetrate. Probably the thickest part is right here, where you have this 20 millimeter plate in front of this 30 millimeter plate, but elsewhere it's good hunting. You know, it is easy to write off the T-28 as a sort of crappy tank, but you have to consider that in 1933, when it was first produced, the French were still using the RT, which was a tiny little tank, and the British didn't. I mean, the T-28 was rather similar to the British Vickers A1E1, but other than that, they didn't have anything else that could match it. And the Germans didn't even have any tanks. However, it didn't actually see combat until 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Poland with Nazi Germany. However, in the opening stages of the Winter War with Finland, it was found that the armor was inadequate, so they upgraded it and actually successfully managed to break the Finnish defenses. However, by, the time Germany invaded, most German anti-tank rounds could pen this thing and take it out. But I think that's where we will end it today. Next time we will go over another set of tanks in another tier, show you some weak spots, and hopefully they'll get a little bit better.